Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Symbolon seminar series. And today is session 9 with Professor Louis Kauffman. And here is our team members, Adel Shaibi, computer scientist at Intel, and Heyoung Kim, myself, associate researcher at Économie Supérieure in Paris. And we also have Eric Petit, research engineer, also at Intel, and Quentin Barbier, technical account manager, also working at Intel. And we have our graphic designer, Alex Giraud. And we today are going to talk with Professor Louis Kauffman, professor of mathematics at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And we are in Chicago right now. You can't really see, but in the back you can see the Lake Michigan, although it's probably not visible in the video. And we're very happy to have Professor Kauffman for our 9th session. And today's talk is Autopoiesis and Eigenform.
Okay, so we'll start. I want to begin by recalling some work by Francisco Varela and Joe Goedelian, and also Varela and Maturana and Ricardo Uribe. These are papers from a while back. There's a paper called Arithmetic of Closure, in which they talk about the notion of a whole system and the thesis that in order to think about a whole, you want to think about its operational closure, that every distinguishable system whole is distinguished through its stable properties arising from its being organizationally closed. If that sounds circular, we'll see what kind of circularity this is as we go along. And Varela, Maturana, and Uribe wrote a key paper in the 1970s entitled Autopoiesis, the Organization of Living Systems, Its Characterization in a Model. And they are looking at living systems through the lens of that notion of operational closure. And I'm not going to go into the formal details of this model, but rather I'm going to show you a model of their model, which they used. I think I prefer this picture. So I want to describe this model for you. And what you're looking at here is a computer model that could be run and was run at that time, consisting of some molecules in a lattice. They're these little circular locations, and a special molecule. There might be numerous of them, which is a black 5-pointed star in this illustration. And that model, that entity is a catalyst. And what it is catalytic for is the linking of molecules together. So in the second, at time equals 1, you see some movement of the molecules, and you see some molecules becoming active, little squares, and then you see the little squares are linked to one another, and the catalyst has the capacity to promote linking among the small molecules if they're near it. Also, the catalyst can't move through the small molecules, but the small molecules can move through one another or past one another quite easily. So you see, as time goes on, more linkage occurs nearby the catalyst, and effectively, after a while, the catalyst becomes completely surrounded by linked molecules, and we have a little protocell that has occurred in this computer space. And once now know that everything is undergoing perturbation. So sometimes the linkages fail, sometimes the molecules move around, but nevertheless, in the presence of a catalyst, there is a high probability for the formation and of a protocell. And once the protocell is formed, it tends to continue. So this is exactly an example of operational closure, where the operations are all these perturbations that are going on in this system, but in relation to the rules that the molecules follow, and life arises from the substrate. And you can ask, well, what happened here? How did this happen? For one thing, there is a certain form that occurred, which is a circular form around the catalyst. And that, of course, has to do with the ambient space being two-dimensional. If we had a three-dimensional soup of molecules and we tried the same game, we probably would have to try various experiments with the rules in order to get a stable three-dimensional enclosure of a catalyst, as could happen in 3 dimensions. But the rules turn out to be very simple in 2 dimensions because it's actually rather easy to draw a closed curve that goes all the way around something in 2 dimensions. So, so what you see here is there was no protocell beforehand. The protocell and its organization arose out of the interaction rules that and the high probability of the formation of such a structure in this space. So it's a very simple example, but it suggests that we could look for the spontaneous generation of lifelike forms. We could look for the spontaneous generation of cybernetic entities, which are always maintaining up to a point their organization through the replacement of their apparent parts by other parts in the environment through the processes that are involved. And so this was taken by those fellows as a prototypical example of their idea of autopoiesis. And what I want to think about is what is going on in this kind of system. And I see that what I decided to talk about is a little more in the direction of the recursion that is present here. And there is a recursion present here. At every stage, certain kinds of standard things are happening. Molecules are getting bound together. Molecules are falling apart. The catalyst is present. The possibility of a circular enclosure is available in the plane. All kinds of things are possible within the recursion of this system. And so what I want to look at, among other things, are very, very simple recursions, and how very simple recursions and what patterns they give rise to are related to this one, which I would like you to keep in mind, because there's something surprising about this one, maybe a little closer to the way life arises or life works or biological systems work than some of the more abstract mathematical examples. So let's continue. I have written here, and let me read it. In the Maturana or Uribe Varela model for autopoiesis, we have a space S in which distinctions are possible, the plane space of the model. Those are the possibilities of making closed curves that could surround the catalyst. And there are entities called catalysts in the space. Linkages of other entities tend to occur in the neighborhood of a catalyst. The catalyst cannot move across the linkages. Linkages can decay with some probability. These conditions lead to the possibility that a linkage may form in the neighborhood of a catalyst so that the catalyst is captured inside a distinction, a corral, made by the linkages that occur in the neighborhood of the catalyst. But you see, if you think about it abstractly, then you can think of many other examples which are in the neighborhood of this kind of process. For example, you can think of a charismatic leader who attracts many people into his orbit, and an organization or a movement or a religion or a political situation arises in relation to that. You can look in the formation of dynamic forms for what is catalytic, what constitutes linkage, the linkage corresponds to different kinds of communication lines between people, or perhaps contracts. And if we think of linkages in terms of contracts, then we are going in the direction of what happens in social space or what happens in definitional space, as in mathematics. Um, and and the world is full of those kinds of contracts that arose. And we do not always know what kind of large scale forms are going to occur as a result of all the local catalytic situations and contractual situations that occur. So this example I take to be a very important key for thinking about how organizations arise and how they persist. And I say contracts with intent because you understand how political organizations like say a government arises very importantly through its constitution or other contracts that form the linkages that are holding it together in the presence of operant persons and perturbations and the arising of different forms of catalyst and so on. So there's a lot to think about here, and we could stop the talk here and just have a discussion about these themes, but I thought I would go on and talk about some more examples.
Please.
Another example that I find to be useful for my thinking is the example of a knot, like the knot you see on the left or the knot you see on the right. And what's intended to be depicted here is some rope of two different types. Maybe you have a red rope on the left and a blue rope on the right, and they are spliced together. And then you can imagine taking the knot, which is on the left, and moving it along until it ends up looking just like the one on the right. But when you did that, it's worth thinking about it. The knot is a stable organization, stable under perturbations. It's stable under perturbations because of the space in which things are happening. So it's very analogous to what we had before. And the substrate that constitutes the support of the knot can change completely, just as the knot on the left is made in red rope and the knot on the right is made in blue rope. And we can illustrate this with real rope, but since the camera is aimed at in a certain way, I won't try it with real rope. But you see how that here we have, again, an example of something which is organizationally closed. And in fact, if you were to tie the knot around and take its ends to one another like this, like I could tie a knot in my arms and then attach a rope from the left arm to the right arm, and you would have an organizational closure. The knot remains. You can push things around. You can perturb them. In that case, it isn't a matter of it falling apart due to linkage, but we could even think of doing autopoiesis with knots, but that would be another kind of experiment. The point I'm making here is that it's very stark with the knot that the structure, the pattern of the knot, needs a substrate in order to appear, just like the closure and the protocell needed those molecules in order to appear, but the exact constitution of the substrate can change entirely and the pattern remains. And so it is in biological situations where we go along from time to next time to next time until our biological substrate is almost entirely different from what it was a few years ago. Other examples can be made by using computer models that weren't available at the time when Varela and his collaborators were working. For example, I happen to like this one, but I won't demonstrate it for you in the interest of time. But there is a program which you might enjoy experimenting with. It's called Golly, Golly, free downloadable cellular automata program, and you can program it in the simplest possible way. You write a rule like the one on the left here, which says, born if you have 3 or 7 neighbors, / survive if you have 4, 5, 6, or 7 neighbors. That's a rule. And then the automaton looks at every square in the board, and if it's white, it asks, will you survive? Checks the number of neighbors. If you don't have 4, 5, 6, or 7 neighbors, you perish. If there are 3 or 7 neighbors of a black space, it will be born on the next generation. And this then is a recursion, which allows the system to keep on going. You can walk in and perturb it from the outside. And so you can do experiments with this, which are kind of similar to the original autopoiesis experiment. And you will find, if you play with this one, that some of its incarnations look very biological, and they like to rebuild themselves if you cut pieces of them out or push at them. And so the organizational closure has a kind of rebuilding capacity, a resistance to perturbation. And of course, you can change these rules in many different ways and play with these ideas. So I recommend it, and we might, at another conversation, actually look at this kind of thing. Let's listen to Maturana and company on this paragraph, and then we'll go to some other examples. They say every unity can be treated either as an unanalyzable whole endowed with constitutive properties which define it as a unity, or else as a complex system that is realized as a unity through its components and their mutual relations. If the latter is the case, a complex system is defined as a unity by the relations between its components which realize the system as a whole, and its properties as a unity are determined by the way this unity is defined, and not by particular properties of its components. It is these relations which define a complex system as a unity and constitute its organization. Accordingly, the same organization may be realized in different systems with different kinds of components, as long as these components have the properties which realize the required relations. It is obvious that with respect to their organization, such systems are members of the same class, even though with respect to the nature of their components, they may be distinct. And all of that speaks to the things that I was saying with these examples here, and I let you think about that. Another concept that I want to use, and I've illustrated it here right at the beginning, but we'll run into it again, is the notion of a reflexive domain. In a reflexive domain, every operator is also an element of the domain, and every element of the domain is an operator. Now, everything in all the examples that we've been looking at, that is the case. The molecules are in fact operators that are important for the catalytic process, and on the other hand, they are elements of the domain which can be used to construct higher order entities. On the other hand, you'll notice that in the formation of this system, we had these entities, molecules, catalysts, the fact of the space, but then, at least from our point of view, a new entity arose, which is the cell itself. And the cell itself wasn't here beforehand, but arose out of the operational process, which led to something which was organizationally closed and persisting in time, so that new entities can arise in the domain which were not there before. So at least from the point of view of our observation, by the time we got to this later time, the domain does not just consist of molecules, catalysts, and the possibility of linkages. It also contains cells. And of course, you'll know this, and you must have had the thought, what about interactions of cells? And in this model, it's not obvious how one goes on. I think that's a nice question. in terms of just making models that have very simple rules. Well, how will the cells interact? How will they interact and produce even higher entities and so on? And we're used to this in biology, that this kind of thing happens. And we're used to this in the social domain, and we're used to this in the intellectual domain. So by the time you were counting, for whatever purposes you were counting long, long ago before you were born, um, um, then properties of numbers came to mind for people, and they started studying prime numbers, or they started studying the way certain collections of numbers behave, or geometries behave. And more entities which are operationally closed for us keep arising, and we look at how they are interacting. So the idea of the reflexive domain is not only that every operator is also an element and every element is also an operator, but that you should be able to produce new elements at will, at least within some linguistic restrictions. So, for example, I'm imagining a reflexive domain and I have an F in it, and I define a new operator, and that operator applied to an X is F applied to X applied to itself. Or formally, I duplicate X, I make two copies of it, and I put it inside of F's box. So it might be as simple as that. If you'd look on the bottom part of the slide here, I hope you see my arrow moving around. If you don't, I'll describe it in any case. G applied to that little figure is a box around two copies of the little figure. So G duplicates and puts in a box. That's what G does. And this is a rather prosaic entity as long as you allow that things could be duplicated. And of course, that's a certain level of things where duplication could happen. But what happens if you apply G to itself? Now, G is something new that you brought in by defining it, but now we're regarding it as another entity like all the others, and we could apply G to itself. And then you see two copies of G inside the box, but that is interpreted as G applied to itself. So GG is sitting inside the box, which is GG, and we're looking at a self-reference or a recursion that's going to be happening automatically as a result of allowing a reflexive domain. So what happened is that we got a fixed point for putting a box around it, but we also found a self-reference. And in fact, I think I want to point out to you right now the simplest examples of that. So I wanted to point out the simplest possibility here. The simplest possibility here is an operator D, which it duplicates. So that D applied to X gives rise to two copies of X. If duplication could be happening, then this happens. And then what happens is that if you apply D to this fellow, you get two copies. And that all seems more or less normal. But if you apply D to itself, then you get two copies of D. So you have self-reference. You have circularity. So that so in a certain sense, the circularity and self-reference are inevitable. And pardon my spelling, but this is in this highly simplified way the core of why circularity and self-reference are inevitable and incompleteness theorems happen and systems need to get outside themselves, or we need to get outside of systems in order to understand them. And all of those things are just coming from this one utterly simple thing. And paradoxes as well, so that the next stage that's so closely related to this is the Russell paradox, which I will write in this abstract form. I'll say it the way Russell said it. X is a member of R means that it is not the case that X is a member of X. Where juxtaposition means membership, X is a member of R means that it is not the case that X is a member of X. But you see, this is just the duplication operator with a negation in it. And then when you apply it to itself, you get the negation of the construction of R interacting with R. You get a paradox. And so you can't easily avoid paradoxes either. And when you want to have a system, a mathematical system that doesn't have any paradoxes, then you have to work very hard because it's so easy for it to happen. Well, that was the side comment I wanted to make about what I'm doing in this slide, but now let's go back. So there's a general theory of the arising of stable forms called eigenforms. And in this theory, one is given a transformation that acts on forms. And the transformation might be part of the domain itself, just like we saw a moment ago. And remember, there's nothing, it always depends on who you're talking to or who's talking, whether this seems esoteric or not. For a mathematician, the idea of including the transformations in the domain looks a little esoteric because we've been very careful not to have paradoxes. And we know that by including the transformations in the domain, we can easily get paradoxes, just like I showed you. On the other hand, if we're talking about people in the world, well, people are transformers of the domain of the world, and they also act on the domain of the world, and it's all circular in exactly this fashion. And so it depends on where you are, whether this is esoteric or ordinary. Making new forms, TX, and repeated application on an initial form will produce a concatenation of the operation. And if you let the concatenation go on and on and on, then that's one way of getting a fixed point, different from the one I just showed you that was more in the form of duplication. You could get a fixed point by just getting tired of replying one more T to that picture that you just had there. Or I have a picture in a moment, so I'll just continue. So I'll call G that concatenation that's invariant under T. I'll call it an eigenform for T. And at the point where there's the identity Tg equals G for an observer of the system, we say we have an eigenform. If the process is complex, as in autopoiesis, then sometime we'll leave the form the same for the observer, and sometimes steps will make a difference. And so you can have disintegration and reappearance of the form. You can have all kinds of things going on here. But we're looking at, say, the simplest example. So I might take a little box in the form of a parenthesis here, J naught, and T applied to it is to put a parenthesis around it. So I keep on doing this over and over again, and I get this nest of parentheses. By the time you got to J7, it's hard to count whether putting one more parenthesis on there changed it at all. It looks the same to you. And so you say that you have an eigenform. There it is. But you could have taken it to infinity, and then literally at the mathematical level, if you believe in infinity, then you would have a fixed point also. So we could think of it in terms of a box within a box within a box forever, and then one more box won't matter. Another example is here's a beautiful mathematical number, 1 plus the square root of 5 over 2. Now, I should explain on my slide that 1 plus the square root of 5 divided by 2, let's call it phi. That's a famous number. It's the golden ratio. But it has the following property, which you could verify, that phi squared is equal to phi plus 1. And in fact, that's the kind of relationship that gave rise to the number, because people originally think of the golden ratio as having to do with a rectangle, maybe 1 by phi this way, and you find that if you cut a 1 by 1 square off of the rectangle, then the ratio of this 1 to this alpha, which I'll worry about, 1 to alpha, is equal to phi to 1. What I mean is that this rectangle here that I obtained from this larger rectangle has the same proportion as the larger rectangle. And that's been a source of proportion and symmetry in art, and it's seen in biology and so on. And you see that if I were to write this out, I decided to do it. What is this alpha? This alpha is phi minus 1, isn't it? So we have phi minus 1. I just took away 1 from the phi. Phi minus 1 is alpha. So I can write my equation 1 is to alpha as phi is to 1. And I get 1 cross multiplying is equal to phi times phi minus 1, which is equal to phi squared minus phi. And so I get that phi squared is equal to phi plus 1. So this equation about phi is a geometrical equation. And then you can solve the equation and get that nice form. But it isn't obvious in this form that there's something special about phi. But when you look at it this way, you see there's something special about phi, because you could divide by phi this equation, and you get 1 plus 1 over phi. And now you see it says that phi is the fixed point of the transformation 1 plus 1 over that. And you can go farther with that. You can go farther with that and say, if phi is equal to 1 plus 1 over phi, then I could write phi is equal to 1 plus 1 over 1 plus 1 over phi, and so on, right? And so you would get that phi is equal to 1 plus 1 over 1 plus 1 over 1 plus 1 over 1 plus 1 over 1 plus, and so on forever. And then you see that actually is formally working exactly right, because what you see here in my parentheses, there's phi all over again if it's 1 plus 1 over forever. So this is like the boxes, only now it's more than the boxes. It's also interacting with the numbers, and it's actually working right. If you calculated it more and more, it would get closer and closer to that number that we were looking at. So there's much geometrical, mathematical lore about the golden ratio, and one can write it like that. But it's an eigenform. So the golden ratio is an eigenform, and it's a geometrical eigenform. It's also a formal eigenform. All those things are mixing up with one another. And the way they mix up with one another is like linkages at another level, of course, right? That we have the linkage that goes on between this form and the geometry and so on, so that a larger linguistic domain, a conversational domain, is arising all about this eigenform. So this is generally what is happening with eigenforms. I'm using a mathematical example where it isn't just isolated. There is some larger domain in which someone is observing something, someone may be making new mathematics or new ideas in relation to it. all the way back to our original example, that is the case. Another simple one would be an infinite sum of ones, which of course is infinite, but it also has the property that if it's 1 plus itself, right? 1 plus g is g. Or in our visual experience, the infinite mirroring situation. And ask yourself, how did that happen? How did that happen? There had to be another mirror there. You're standing between two mirrors. The photographer is standing between two mirrors. Many things you can ask about that. So I'm letting you read this because this is just formalism, and I know we're running out of time. So I think I'm going to skip this bit of the formalism, if you don't mind. I'm thinking of an entity which, for some reason, whenever you see it, you can put a star next to it. Well, then you could keep on doing that forever, and it would look like an infinite row of stars after a while, and the entity becomes the generator for the stars. And then there's the one that we were talking about already. I already told you about G putting a bracket around a duplicate. So we already talked about that. So we're going to skip forward a little bit because I want to talk about another kind of eigenform that doesn't involve infinity in the same way, and it doesn't involve this kind of duplication or operational self-reference either. That's very simple. Suppose I consider the operation, well, suppose I consider the statement, I am the one who says I, all right? And we all agree that that's a meaningful statement. But the two I's in the statement can be seen to be the same I. They can both refer to me. Or it can be understood that one of them is the one who observes the other. And that's a property of I itself, that I can observe I. So there's a depth of meaning having to do with the use of the word I that is in that eigen statement, but it is a fixed point, right? The one who says X is the operator, and I is fixed under the one who says I. The one who says I is I. I equals the one who says I. And we have an eigenform in which things just fit together. They fit together in the space of meaning of the word I. Another example, which is a little bit buried in this paragraph, but look at it, maybe I had it separated. No, I didn't, not in this slideshow. So you can look at that. This sentence has 33 letters. The space of meanings involved here is much simpler. It's just literal. There are 33 letters in that sentence. That sentence is true. And so we're again looking at an eigenform or an organizational stability in the meaning of the thing. You have to check, of course, that it really does have 33 letters. So autopoiesis gives rise to eigenforms in the most general sense. And those are dynamical eigenforms when we're thinking about autopoiesis, like the original biological or sociological kind of examples that we've been talking about. They are, but they're eigenforms nonetheless. They are fixed points up to some level of observation.
You can go. We can start.
Anytime.
Yes.
Okay. So now I want to talk about self-replication. And we'll begin with von Neumann's method of creating an entity that can reproduce itself. Von Neumann's method, which he conceived in the 1940s, I believe, is that you have B, which stands for a universal building machine. B, when supplied with a blueprint or description, X, little x in this diagram, will proceed to build capital X, whatever little x describes. So if little x is a description of a woodshed, then the universal building machine gets to work and builds a woodshed, capital X, and puts it and the blueprint right next to itself. So here is B all over again, and right next to B is standing the woodshed and the description of the woodshed. B duplicates the description and makes the object. Well, you can see from this that if we gave B the blueprint for itself, if X was equal to little b, the description of the universal building machine, then B would proceed to build a copy of itself with a blueprint next to it. And so you would find that B little b became B little b and another copy, B little b, just like a cell dividing somehow. But the question then is this like a cell dividing, or is this somehow different from that, this programmatic way of reproducing? Well, if you think about DNA, you realize that there is some affinity between von Neumann's method and the way that the biologists have found that cells reproduce. Because if we had an amoeba and it was going to reproduce, then what we have to look is inside the cell and find that not only did the amoeba make a duplicate copy of itself, but that the DNA in the amoeba was duplicated. And DNA turns out to be a fundamental, just self-duplicating molecule. And how does that happen? Well, the DNA consists of two long strands, a Watson strand and a Crick strand, we'll call them, bound by bases. There are bases along the Watson strand that are bound to corresponding bases along the Crick strand. So there are these base pairs where the bindings occur. And the idea for that, nature's idea for duplicating the DNA, is to get the two strands apart and then allow the environment to provide the binding of new base pairs to the original strand. So that is what actually happens in the cell, that there are enzymes which pull the two strands apart until you have something which is like the bottom of the slide here, where there's a Watson strand on the top and a Crick strand on the bottom, separated a bit from one another, no longer bound to one another. And then in the environment, there's a big population of bases, and they can fit along the edges of Watson and form a new Crick strand that goes all the way along Watson. And similarly, with the Crick strand, a new Watson strand can form all the way along the Crick, and you end up with two DNAs. This exacting process actually goes on, and the amoeba will end up with two DNAs ready to divide, and then more mechanism occurs, and the two cells occur, each with its own DNA. So the key thing is that the DNA reproduces itself. And how does the DNA reproduce itself? Well, if you think about it, you see that it's similar to the building machine, but it's a very special building machine. What can be built out of the mechanism of the DNA is another DNA, and that's all it can build. But on the other hand, each of the strands of the DNA is, in fact, a blueprint for making a whole DNA, and that blueprint can turn into the building of the whole DNA by putting the strand into an environment that has all the parts. And then the parts will automatically fit together into the complementary strand, and we find ourselves with DNA reproduced. So in the DNA, the building machine and the program for the building machine, the blueprint, are actually inseparable from one another. So the real difference between the von Neumann description and what happens in the cell is this inseparability. And if you think about how nature behaves, of course, it isn't so surprising that the inseparability is important and worth thinking about. So we have that DNA is a Watson-Crick, and that a Watson plus an environment yields a Watson-Crick, and that an environment plus a Crick yields a Watson-Crick. And so the DNA can reproduce by pulling itself apart, being interacted with the environment, and getting two DNAs. I'm going to skip the next part and go to a topological replication. So look at this bit of diagram here. I have an entity P here, and the entity consists of strands, topologist strands, that go from the top edge to the bottom edge, or from the top edge to the top edge. And this entity can reproduce itself by pulling apart from itself a bit, and then wiggling a little bit in the middle, and then allowing itself to be cut apart. And now you see I have two copies of the very same entity that way. And if you think about this a little bit, the pulling apart is like Watson and Crick being pulled apart into the environment. And the introduction of the wiggle is like what happened in the environment. And if we look at this a little more closely, we can see the analogy, because if we cut the original entity P in half here, we have an upper half and a lower half, which is like a Watson and a Crick. But now you'll notice that if we put them in the opposite order, Crick to Watson, this is different from DNA, of course, the wiggle appears. So what we have is that P is an AB, but but if we think of BA as a nothing, and it is a nothing, you see, BA is just the wiggle. So BA can be brought up from nothing or out of the environment. Then we can say AB pulled apart becomes environment or nothing, and the nothing can become a BA. So we put a BA in the middle, but oh, well, there we are, because now we have AB, and that's P reproduced. So this is a topological arena in which you can examine many different types of reproduction, many different forms of it in this form, and think about them. And I believe we should think a little more carefully about how this might be related to biology. But at the moment, it's a bit of topological mathematics. Another aspect of the topological mathematics of biology is processive recombination. You can start with a long DNA molecule like this, twist it up a bit, and it may interact with itself through an enzyme that cuts it and recombines it like that. And then it's no longer one long strand of DNA, it might be two long strands of DNA linked up with one another, like K1 in my slide. And if it happened again over here, this interacted with this, cut and recombined, you could get a knot. And then it could happen again and you would get a link and again. And this is called processive recombination. And if you could see these, then you would know something about what kind of process of recombination was happening. How can you see them? They're very small. But it is in fact possible to see the knotted DNA by using electron microscope techniques. And so people have done experiments that correspond to the diagram I'm showing you, where the electron microscope pictures of the products of the recombination are a certain sequence of knots and links. And from that, they can deduce what's happening in the black box of the recombination. It couldn't have been anything but this right-handed twist happening if it were going to produce these knots. That requires some topological reasoning. So it's possible to look into the topology in the biology. Now, we already talked about reflexive domains, and I'm not going to go into it more in this talk, but I do want to talk about fractals a little bit. Here is because fractals are related to self-reproduction, how do you get to a fractal form from a given line drawing like this? A well-known method that probably almost everyone has seen by now is that you take the form as a whole, in this case, line, triangle, line, and you reinsert it into each line in the form. So the original line had the original form had 4 lines, and into each of them I have inserted the line, triangle, line, line, triangle, line, line, triangle, line, line, triangle, line. And then I do it again with each of these edges, shrinking as I go. And in the end, I get the Koch curve, a famous snowflake curve, and it has many interesting properties. So when you do this kind of recursion, the eigenform that you get in the end is of geometric interest and sometimes of biological interest as well. For example, your lungs, or the Nautilus seashell, or many other cases where some kind of biological geometrical recursion is occurring. We can't tell beforehand how it's going to look in the end. A good example of that I like is this one. I start with just a 90-degree mark like this, two edges at 90 degrees to one another, and I'm going to insert that into itself. So this edge becomes a 90-degree bend, and this edge becomes a 90-degree bend, and we get this picture. And then we do it again and again and again. And after a few steps, the end form begins to become apparent, but it isn't obvious that it would do this. The end form is this kind of remarkable snail-like form, which, if you look at it carefully, consists in 2 copies, 2 snails that are superimposed on one another and turned at 90 degrees to one another, just as you should have expected that from the original shape. But it's hard to predict. And the fact that it's hard to predict is part of the interest. Another example is describing. If we begin describing and then describe the describing and describe that and keep on describing in that way, we end up in a linguistic situation which is not so far away from our ordinary language, where at any given point in language, we are always describing the language and thoughts that have occurred so far. If you look at very elementary mathematical examples of that, you will see things like this: 1, 1, 1, 2 ones, 1, 2, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2 ones, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2 ones, and so on. And I'm describing and describing, and I get a more and more complex sequence of digits coming out, worthy of some mathematical exploration. In the case of this one, it was explored rather deeply by John Norton Conway, a mathematician who loved recursions. If you start with 3 rather than 1, then I notice an interesting pattern. If I start with 3, then I get 1, 3, 1, 1, 1, 3, and so on. But what happens is that if you drop down 3 from where you started, so for example, from 3, 1, 2, 3, you find that it extends 3, 3, 3, 1, 1, 3, 3, 1, 1, 3, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, 1, 1, 3, and so on. So that actually associated to this, there is an infinite sequence. Associated to this, there's an infinite sequence. And associated to this, there's an infinite sequence. The second sequence describes the first sequence. The third sequence describes the second. And the first describes the third, as I've illustrated here, where this is the first in what I was just describing. You see 3, 1, 1, 3, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2. That guy. It's described by C. 1, 3, 1, 3, 2 1s, 1, 3, 2 1s, 3 2s, and so on. So C describes B, A describes C, B describes A in a circle like that. So that's an eigenform. what happens when you look at describing is quite remarkable. So we ought to relax for a moment and complicate it. But the simplest example of describing is surely 2-2. 2-2 describes 2-2s, and so describes itself. And that's our duplication that we started with back in the beginning of the talk. Now, I want to talk about another act of describing. Very simple. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have a row of characters, and I'm going to describe the condition of each character. For example, the A here could be described by saying it's different from the character on its left, and it's different from the character on its right. When that happens, I write star. I don't worry about the fact that the characters on left and right happen to be equal to one another. I'm keeping it simple. Then what about the B here? This B is different from A, but it's equal to the B on its left. So I will use equal to the one on the left by writing a bracket that's open on the left and vertically closed on the right, a parenthesis. So a parenthesis that has its wall on the right is saying to the right it's different, to the left it's equal. So here, this B is different on the left, but equal on the right. So you see, we can then take the entire string of characters and make a description. In this case, that's my description because I decided to just use nothing, the absence of a character, a blank character, if things were equal on both sides. So let's look at this simple entity that arose out of, so this entity, this sort of little walled entity consisting of two parentheses bound by a star in the middle, like our catalyst to begin with, a little protocell, but in a different form. This arises from the singularity of one change in a long list of characters. One change, and the little protocell arises. And now what happens when we describe the little protocell? Let's look. The star is described by star because the entities on the characters on either side are different. The left character is different from both what's on its left, which is nothing, and what's on its right. So I get difference again. And this right character gets difference. And then the blank here is equal to the blank on its right and unequal to the blank on its left, so it gets a left parenthesis. And the other blank nearby gets a right parenthesis. And so our protocell, like a DNA, opened up a little bit. And then when we make the next description, it reproduces itself. You can follow it out from the description. You can go from left and you get a parenthesis. Then the parenthesis is unequal to what's on either side of it. Then the star is unequal to what's on either side of it. I'm sorry, the star is equal on the right. So when we got this far, blank, parenthesis, star with a star next to it, we arrived at a protocell. And then we got another protocell, and in the middle we got a blank because these two stars are equal to the star in the middle. So it reproduced itself. So this is a little technical, but it's also kind of fascinating because it looks just like the Watson-Crick self-replication that we opened into the environment, in this case, a kind of characterological linguistic environment, but it's also reminiscent of the catalyst and molecular bonding that we started with in the beginning. So this is a kind of autopoiesis going on in a different form from the original experiment, and it gives rise to many questions, not the least of which is, how is this related to DNA reproduction? Think about it. In DNA reproduction, there were the complementary molecules already existing in the soup, in the vitro, in the cell. They were already there, and they could be plugged in. Just like if I'm doing a building project, I make sure that I have all the nails and pieces that I can put together to use. But here, it was out of description that this binding entity, the left parenthesis, occurred. It was out of description that it came into being, and then it was allowed to combine, and the two protocells arose, or the two DNAs arose out of the process of description. So when we're at this descriptive level, entities arise just out of description itself. And of course, then we're verging on the symbolic level rather than the actual physical level that we're used to. And we go back and forth. We, as mathematicians, of course, because we study patterns, are always going back and forth between the physical and the metaphysical levels. But the question of how you went from something as concrete as originally described as the Maturana, Uribe, Varela autopoiesis happening in a molecular domain to the metaphysical level of autopoiesis happening in the symbolic domain, that's worth thinking about. And I'll stop here and hope to engage in some discussion at a later date.
Thank you so much for your lecture. And we'll have more discussion with Eric and Adele in another separate discussion session, but maybe we can talk a little bit between us. I mean, it's a fascinating lecture. I mean, I knew a lot of this before already, but listening to this again, it's very relevant to our discussion as well.
I think so.
Right. Your our former joint talk was recorded and released on this channel as well, which is on conversation and how in a conversation shared consciousness is arising, and how on this conscious and linguistic level we can think of this. It's all very relevant, but especially related to the eigenform. I wanted to ask to I wanted to ask you to say a little more about the eigenform and the knots, because it's as you mentioned in the beginning, it's very much related, but in the lecture you didn't have chance to talk more about it. We didn't really go into that so much, especially describing that A describing B describing C describing A. For example, this is very much in the form of Borromean rings, and so there's this connection, but I think it's probably not that clear for the
Yeah,
audience.
that's right. That could be expanded. Many of the things we're talking about can be expanded. But let's go back to this slide. We're still recording, right? So we could go back to this slide where
They don't see the slides now, he says.
Mhm. Pardon me?
You have to share.
You have to share the screen again.
But I have been. I did not share. I didn't leave share.
I lost it.
He lost it, so
So does that mean I need to go through the it
Maybe.
does. It means I have to go to the
can you come and see maybe?
just a minute. Same code. Oh, no.
Oh, here.
See,
Yeah, so you can just
we're
share.
okay.
Yeah.
All right. So now we're sharing screen, right? And then I was pulling back to here.
Mm-hmm.
And let's not worry about the sequences, but look at what I drew in the center. Let's magnify it. So what I drew in the center is another analogy for us to think about, because here we have a link of 3 rings, and and you need all 3. It's a tripartite relationship. You need all 3 rings in order for them to be linked. If I remove the blue ring, then green and red float apart. If I remove the red ring, then blue and green float apart, and so on. So each one depends on the other 2 for its existence. And so I'm playing with the analogy that each of these sequences depends on the other 2 for its existence. For example, if you only had A, you can find B and C with no trouble, right? You would describe A, and then you'd describe B, and then amazingly, you would describe C and find that you came back to A, right? So A is some magic sequence that you found on the ground, and you discovered that B and C were implicit in it. And similarly, B implies A and C, and so on. So this kind of mutual dependency is related at least structurally to the kind of mutual dependency that means that if I have a link of 2 components, then each one is needed for the other one to be linked to the other one. And if we were to start exploring that, we can go down a line which would take us another time, but I'm looking for my drawing board. I think we let it go just a second. Okay. So you see, I could say, well, I have an A, which if I look into it, I'll find a B. This could be described, right? And if I have a B and I look into it, then I find a C. And if I have a C and I look into it, then I find an A. Right? And if I try to diagram this, I might in fact say, well, what I mean by inside it could be, I'll just use one color. Because you see, A is over B. Right?
Yeah.
So we could say over B, right? And B is over C. But we look at C and we find that C is over A. And that happened because of the weaving, right? It's the weaving that's making that possible. And it's the weaving that is keeping these together. So if you're going to study the topology, then you're studying the properties of weaving. And this is a very beautiful example of how weaving can create tripartite relationship of this kind. One can, the other sort of thing that comes up in thinking about knots is, as I was saying before, that if you had a knot on a rope like that, well then, what is keeping it from being unknotted? What is keeping it knotted, right? And it may be easier, I'm not sure whether the camera gets this or not, or does the camera see the rope? Yeah, okay. But not the screen, it's not on the screen, but let's play with it for a moment anyway. If we we tie a knot in the rope. Then, yeah, if we tie a knot in the rope, then we have this entity which is organizationally closed, an autopoietic entity, if you like, of rope. And we can do lots of different perturbations to the rope, but the knot remains. And one can study mathematically what is going on that makes this retained. But you can also just do a little bit of experimenting of your own about what makes it retained, because maybe you're a magician. And so you show people the tying of the knot, and you show them that indeed they have a beautiful trefoil knot on the rope. And how could this disappear? How could this disappear? But it can disappear because it was never there. And I did almost everything I needed in order to make it. I made a loop, and then in order to make a knot, I need to bring the rope through the loop. And if I do it this way, the way you see me doing it, then indeed I'm okay. But if I did it the other way, if I brought this line through the loop in the other direction, I'm not okay. This way of putting it through the loop doesn't stabilize the loop. You now have a situation that under perturbation comes apart. So that gives rise to the magic trick, of course, but it also happens in ways that are hard to understand for everybody. For example, I tie a knot in the rope, then I tie another knot in the rope, a weave. I have this weave. Maybe we'll just pull that down. I have this weave. And I make this a little more complicated, weaving this in through here. And then I make it apparently even more complicated by putting it through one more time. And you're now looking at something which, if you travel along, it has some knots in it, but in fact it isn't knotted. It isn't knotted. It can undergo perturbation and come apart. So then you have a mathematical problem. Which ones of these are stable? Which ones are not? And on the other hand, they can be described, and the descriptions are often circular, and so you end up needing to deal with circular descriptions of something. So, for example, if you were going to describe this knot to someone, maybe you want to tell them what to do over the phone, you want to tell them how to weave it, then you might say to them, well, walk along it and you'll go over this first crossing, and then you go under the second crossing, and then you go over the first crossing, and then you come back around and you go under the first crossing and over the second and under the third, and then you'll be back to where you started, describing the pathway of walking along the knot. And that's sufficient for telling someone else how to make it. And there are other ways which people have found to encode weaving patterns. And all those encodements are close to being circular, if not circular. And then in order to step back and make a theory about these, we have to act like cyberneticians in a certain sense and analyze circular interconnected patterns. In this case for topology, and in cybernetics for many, many very widely described situations.
Right. And I have just one more question, and we'll have to wrap up for today and have a separate discussion session. So my next question is related to the discussion of consciousness, because we did not really talk about it in this lecture, but what you described the whole time, autopoiesis and eigenform, especially with this fixed form, a fixed point in eigenform, it shows it could present how we imagine the structure of consciousness very well. Not only the DNA and cell replication, self-replication, And what's interesting is, as you mentioned already, and in your explanation of protocell self-replicating, this whole thing works not only at physical level but on a metaphysical level, which is on a linguistic and conscious level. So how we can have this idea of being conscious and how we can be conscious together in a conversation. So all this could might be a good explanation for how this works, how we understand consciousness, how I can have this notion of me being conscious and us being conscious together. So that was my comment slash question to your lecture.
I'm inclined to think about this a little bit stepwise, just to see how things work. So if we went back to, say, the original protocell, and we're observing it, and we push at it a little bit, and we notice, it reconnected there. I broke some of the connections, and it reconnected there. We might say, well, it's conscious of our perturbation. It's conscious of us. It's aware of us. But what actually happened, if you want to be more objective about it, is that it's in its eigenstate, and when it undergoes a perturbation, it tends to go back into the eigenstate. It's possible for us to sweep across it and knock the molecules hither thither, and it wouldn't form that protocell again. Some other protocells would form, but not that one. So when we say, so we see that in a certain level of it, what we call consciousness is having to do with the flexibility of an eigenstate to reconstitute itself under perturbation.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking too, especially in terms of fixed point as well. This fixed point is not something that is actually fixed, like how we imagine, like me as a fixed subject that is unchangeable, but it's something that is created in this eigenform, in this self-referential creation. So in this sense, we can think of consciousness from a whole different point of view. Right?
In this sense, we can think of our consciousness. I can think of my consciousness as a kind of big eigenform that, because I'm awake and I had a little breakfast, is maintaining itself okay, right? And later in the day, it will fall apart. So then we can understand that aspect of things, that it isn't precisely physical, because that kind of maintenance of structure goes out beyond the physical into the metaphysical, in the sense that I was talking about.
But that's why it is more interesting that on this level, unlike the cells, in its self-replication or eigenform, it doesn't need a mechanism behind it, or this building principle that make everything works, but it just works as it is in the form itself.
Well, now it makes you wonder, right? The knot doesn't need this substrate.
Yeah.
It can be whatever it is on another substrate. And we can illustrate that sort of thing very clearly with the knots. Like I like to illustrate this way, that I have the knot on the rope, but I'm going to transfer it to my body. I really can. I've almost transferred it to my body, a little more work. And the rope is completely free, and the knot is on my body. So the knot traveled, went through some topological things, no breaks, no discontinuities, but the knot is now all the way over on my body, and now the knot is back all the way on the rope. And so it is with our consciousness living on the many bodies that we have.
And
but of course, it makes you wonder about
well, then could you transfer your consciousness to another body,
Right.
or a machine,
Mhm.
or some other
Right.
some other physical entity? And there's a huge science fiction,
Right.
at least
right.
literature, and some philosophical
Yeah.
literature on exactly this point.
I think it's not just science fiction, but I was gonna point that out.
In my
actually.
young days, it was just science fiction.
Yes. But what we just discussed now, eigenform and consciousness, I think it actually works better in terms of inter uh, subjective form, meaning that it's not
It's very helpful to think of that.
right.
Because as we converse, we form a mutual
Mhm.
weaving between us,
Mhm.
which is a shared consciousness.
Exactly. Yeah. So, all this was very, very interesting, and of course, we can discuss further. But for today, I think it's time to wrap up, and we'll discuss with the other two guys, Eric and Adele, and in a separate session. Well, thank you so much for your lecture. It was very interesting, and as I mentioned, we'll see Professor Kauffman in another separate session of discussion. And you can find us on YouTube, projet.y, and also on Instagram, TikTok, and X. Um, so thank you, and see you next time.
All right.
Thank you, everybody, for your attention.
Thank you.